Okay, let's see. It tells me on my end we're live. So let me just double check here on the web to see if we really are. There's usually a delay, and this is where we kind of look dorky staring into the camera like, are we there? Okay, yeah, it looks like we are there. So, all right, folks, I want to thank you so much for tuning in for episode number 68 of Talking About Horses. I'm joined by special guest Dr. Stephen Peters. Dr. Stephen Peters is a neuroscientist, author, speaker, and horseman who brings brain science to the barn. I love that. That's a great way to say that. He teaches the popular horse brain science clinics and travels internationally, helping riders understand how the horse's brain works to create better communication, connection, and trust. His newest book, Horse Brain Science by Dr. Stephen Peters, has quickly become a favorite among riders and professionals worldwide. He's also the author of Neuropoetry and best known as the co author of the groundbreaking book, Evidence Based Horsemanship. Dr. Peters lives in Colorado with his wife, Michelle. There's 7 horses and 3 Australian shepherds. Dr. Peters, thank you so much for joining me today for talking about horses.
It's a pleasure to be here, Patrick. And as we had talked about just before we went on the air, it just seems odd that we haven't had a face-to-face conversation with all the circles that we seem to run in and the people that we know. But it's long overdue, that's for sure.
There we go. I agree. I agree. So thank you so much for coming on here and for joining my audience, particularly live as we do this. The live broadcasts like this are always a little challenging, so it's been fun as we've been getting started here. The idea of the echo, we're getting a notice here that there is an echo on my side. So this is one of the little glitches that pops up sometimes when we do these broadcasts live and in real time, and we roll with it. So thank you for agreeing to do this with me instead of it being the ahead of time and we edit things.
Well, I'm pleased to be here, and I think for your audience to know, if they don't know who I am, I'm a neuroscientist. I spent a lot of time, 3 decades, looking at brain scans, actually dissecting horse brains. I saw human patients, but I always had horses. And so I just because of that, I always looked at horses through a neurological lens and tried to understand their brain and how their nervous system function. And I also came from an evidence-based, thus evidence-based horsemanship. I always came from an evidence-based medical approach. And it, it was dumbfounding at times to see how we struggled with looking at horses through a lens that was really anthropomorphic, you know.
Mm.
And it probably didn't do the horse's welfare any good if they were getting blamed for things that they really weren't able to help. Um, and the fact that most of the time, a high percentage of the time, it was us that put the bad wiring in there that got the results that we got. So if we understood how we were wiring a brain and could set up optimal situations, and I mean emotionally and motorically and cognitively, then we could work with the nervous system. And it was dumbfounding to see how people struggled when they worked against the nervous system. You know, we can make
Mm.
horses do just about anything, but, you know, that oftentimes meant conflict types of behaviors, high sympathetic arousal. And then when we got those horses hyper agitated, we think, well, we'll just put on more pressure and make them do something. And we went the wrong way, the opposite way we really would have wanted to go in order to communicate clearly. So I really wasn't aware that there'd be a big audience. I got asked to go to a lot of, to present to veterinarians or go to scientific conferences, but invariably, every conference I went to, there'd be horse people saying, could you talk to my horse group? And when I talked to veterinarians about going to talk to the lay person, the average rider. They said, no, this would be so far over their head that you'd lose them anyway. I didn't ever really think that. I talk to patients every day about complicated medical issues. And so I felt like I could be a translator of actually good science, good, useful science that people could apply with their horses, not just a lot of jargon or fancy studies, but information that would help them stay out of trouble, that would be safer, would help them communicate better, and that in the long run would have their horses performing at a higher level. I mean, a relaxed horse or a horse that understands exactly what you're asking, or if you know enough to stay out of your horse's way, because most of the time it's the harmony and the synchrony of being with your horse. And oftentimes, when you want to over control and micromanage that, you
Mm.
create sympathetic arousal and you lose that rhythm. I mean, if think about it, if you were a dancer, if two people were dancing and one person was going to manhandle the other and take total control, how smooth would that look? And if somebody was really uncoordinated and didn't have much rhythm and was stepping on their partner's feet, but if you could synchronize your movements and get to a feel, and good horse people, I think, always talk about that, having a feeling for the horse, and could get with that feel, it almost becomes, well, it becomes a dialogue instead of a monologue, a back and forth, an understanding. And I truly believe that that's where most people want to be with their horse. Um, but sometimes our ways of training have become so rigid that we seem to be in a box and not be able to look outside of that, even when you know it can benefit us and the horse.
Mm. Yeah. So coming from the human neuroscience perspective of that, what is it that keeps us locked in that box when we struggle?
Well, a number of things. Sometimes what happens is if our beliefs are so linked to our own self-identity, then we just don't want to change. It feels threatening. It creates what we call cognitive dissonance, where
Mm.
where l- giving up a belief means we take it as an insult to our own self-identity. So if we get so tied to what we believe in, then sometimes we can't be open-minded. And then every good scientist, and I mean everybody out there, is basically a scientist. We
Mhm.
have to recognize our own bias. If you don't do that, then it really is hard to get over the hump and learn new things. For example, a confirmation bias, whereby you know you're willing to believe everything that conforms to your beliefs. So if new evidence comes along and it conforms to your belief, you'll accept that. But there's a huge circle outside of that. And good scientists, what they do is they don't have to be right. Their self identity is not tied in being right, it's just getting closer to the truth. And in fact, to get to that point, sometimes to get to a certain level is based on a number of failed hypotheses. So you just know which way not to go to determine
Mm.
which way to go. But if you don't take a look at which way not to go, you may continue to just take that same path. Um, and then you're stuck. So I think being open minded enough to recognize we all have bias. Where do they come from? Our past experience, our teachers, our upbringing. You know, even to say the word horse is going to be different in everybody's brain. If you watched Black Beauty 37 times and you have romantic notions of your horse, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you're going to have a different picture in mind than
Mhm.
somebody who worked in a feedlot or somebody who had a trauma and got bucked off their horse and badly injured. So
Mm,
every perception that we have is personal to us. So recognizing that, and then to make things even more complicated, our horse doesn't live in our world. So they don't
right.
perceive the same things we do, and we don't perceive the same things that they do. If we give them human brain characteristics, and it makes sense because we're not all neuroscientists, and so the only measure we have of comparison is our own brain and our own vision and our own hearing. But you can't move your ears independently. Your horse can. You know, y- your horse sees things that you can't with a 340-degree arc. They feel things that you don't feel. So if you just stop for a moment and realize my horse lives in a totally different world than I
Mm,
live in. And until we can find a common language and understanding of that, we're prone to miscommunication. We're prone to misunderstanding. And nothing gets a horse more sympathetically aroused than getting confused. Getting confused will really do it. And then when we put pressure on and they're confused and they don't really know which way to go, it doesn't often end well for us or the horse.
mm, yeah,
Understand, yeah, it doesn't help to yell at your horse either. If you don't understand French and I'm screaming at you in French, it's not going to help you
right,
to get a
right. So
better
when we're
picture.
telling our when we're yelling at our horse, "Just quit," right? Or, "Just get in the trailer," or, "Get up." You mean that doesn't work?
Oh, well, you can give it a try.
I thought I just wasn't getting loud enough,
But then come back and let's talk a little bit afterwards. Yeah.
right?
And
So just for
that's
our
really
listeners that might not be familiar with the term, when you talk about sympathetic arousal, talk to us about what that means.
okay. The autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic nervous system, which is, as fight or flight, and
Mhm,
parasympathetic nervous system that you may know as rest and digest. Even there, we have misunderstandings because typically people have come to think of the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, as a negative state, and parasympathetic
mm,
as a wonderful state to be in. Well, you can't learn unless you're sympathetically aroused. If you're in the back of the class and your head's down on the desk, so your horse needs some level of arousal in order to focus their attention and to learn. Otherwise there's just no point in it, and they're not getting enough dopamine, a rewarding neurotransmitter, if they're not focused, if they're not somewhat sympathetically aroused. Um,
mm,
play is sympathetic arousal. Sex is sympathetic arousal. So there's some good things up in that sympathetic arousal state. The problem is
mhm,
if we go too high and we get hyper aroused, now we're getting to fight, flight, panic, feeling threatened. Your horse can't think
yeah,
anymore. That's when you say, you stupid horse, you know better. But if they get too sympathetically aroused, then they don't have access to information they learned previously. They're just in a state that they're trying to escape from.
okay. That total self-preservation survival state.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And so what you have to do is then let them reset their nervous system and come back down. If you don't give them time to do that, then they're going to stay chronically sympathetically aroused. And so
Mm,
they're going to be very touchy about even i- things that are safe because they're not going to perceive them as safe.
can we
And
break that cycle?
we actually can. If what we do is we allow our horses to be challenged in learning, and if we go too far, all we do is just back off and let them reset, let them come back down, let
Mm,
them lick and chew, let their head come down below the withers, let them come back down, and know that they can do that. That's called pendulation in the literature,
okay.
going up and coming back down. Now, the cool thing about being challenged is that's where you get the optimum learning. You get something called acetylcholine, and that's a neurochemical you need to focus your attention. You get norepinephrine. That's what you need to be aroused. Not too much because you'll be over aroused, but enough to be aroused and have attention. When you're in that state, that's when you get the highest dopamine hits. And dopamine is highly, highly rewarding. So you want to challenge your horse to get that high dopamine hit and then allow them to reset because they'll start to look for that state. They'll start to want to be challenged because that felt good. And so
Okay.
you get more and more challenging as time goes on, and they tolerate more and more, and they get very comfortable even under a lot of pressure because they know that they'll just self-regulate and be able to come back down.
Gotcha.
Now, if you want to stay in the comfort zone, so to speak, and we don't have enough arousal, and if we're going to drill our horse, you're going to do this, and we're going to turn left, and we're going to turn left, and we're going to turn left, and we're going to turn left. The first time they might get a dopamine hit when you give them, pressure and release. And then they might get less dopamine the second time and less the third time. And by the fourth time, they're starting to get bored and agitated. But we keep trying to get that same thing over and over again. What brains like is what's called a reward prediction error. This is how this works. Let's say we've turned left 4 times. Now we turn right. The horse's brain predicted I would get this much dopamine. And now we've done something new. Wow, that's a bigger dopamine hit. So adding variety to your
Mm.
training and doing things in brief sections and then letting your horse reset. So you give brief chunks where they can optimize their attention. And we always ask horses to do things that we're not capable of doing ourselves. For example, people might say, I'm sitting right in front of my screen. I'm listening to Dr. Peters and Patrick King, and I'm taking this all in, and I'm paying attention as in an incredible laser-focused way. Well, no, you're also saying, well, should I have worn these jeans, and who's going to do the dishes, and
Mm.
you know, this chair's a little hard, and I had trouble hearing that last word, and you just keep pulling yourself back. But attention is so energy intensive that it's almost impossible to maintain. So what we have to do is allow our horses the opportunity to reset and come back, or reset and come back. And this is especially true of young horses who don't have long attention spans, because if we're going to drill them, we're just wasting our time. We're just going to create agitation. And they may learn, but they're going to learn at a slower pace, and they're going to have fragments of information that they don't know how to put together.
Okay. And the learning is gonna have then those diminishing returns if we just keep repeating and drilling. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We need sympathetic arousal in order to get attention. And then that's
Okay.
where we get our high dopamine hit. So we get attention, but that only encodes information. What we need is to come back down and reset, because it's at that point when they come back down to what's called homeostasis, their natural biological balance. When they come back down there, same with us. If we have time to reflect on what we've learned without outside distractions, that's when we consolidate the information we learned by paying attention. So
Gotcha.
you need both, because if you don't consolidate that information, you have bits and pieces, but they're not well put together. They don't move well into long-term memory.
Okay. Okay. So that rest and digest, the coming down to back to the homeostasis like you talk about, that's what's necessary for helping the kind of the longevity and the recall of the experience and the learning.
For us, we might have tried to learn a task. And the point I want to make here in this next thing I'm going to say is that, if we think we're going to just drill And we're going, well, people have crammed for a test and they can see how effective that is 3 weeks later when they ask, well, what was on that test? Right. But let's say you have a task, a motor task, we'll just say that you're struggling with, and you can play around with it for a little while and get more and more irritated. But when you get irritated, it's best to just say, you know what, let me just set this aside. And then you go to sleep at night. And what happens is your whole brain doesn't change, but acetylcholine will go in and set like a highlight marker and say, let's take these neurons and attach them to here. And these seem to be interfering. So let's, prune those away. And actually you rewire. Your brain's very busy. You rewire. And so does your horse in sleep. And the next day, if we haven't drilled, in the next day, all of a sudden you tried that motor task again and somehow magically, wow, you got better at it. That's because your brain had an opportunity to replay it in an area called the hippocampus. It's about even with your ear. That's the structure associated with memory. And it'll replay that task about 20 times and faster and better than you can. And people might say, well, I could do it better by drilling. Well, you can't, because you can't do it as fast and you'll fatigue. If you're trying to do that, by the second or third time, you might fatigue, then you get it wrong, then you get frustrated. But once you have it right in your brain, if you'll step back and let your brain replay this without outside distraction, then you'll actually do something called myelinate those neurons. You'll connect them and then start to get a fatty wrapping on them, and they'll become very efficient. But if you're constantly in a sympathetic state, you're not going to do the same type of wiring, and you're going to just leave chunks of information floating around out there that aren't well connected.
Hmm. Would you say that the sympathetic state is a little bit more energetically expensive for the brain?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So that's why we need this time to reset, because it's energy intensive. We're easily distracted. You know, they looked at humans and they discovered that if you really are focused on something that's challenging, you will only be able to hold at best uh, about an hour, almost an hour of your attention. And after that, your attentional capacity decreases significantly, even though you might not think it does. So that's when you're reading that paragraph for the 14th time, right? Saying, yeah, I read through that book. But what might have been more effective is to have read a chapter and it took you, let's say, an hour, fold that book up, sit back, and do what's called non-sleep deep rest. And that's what science is finding, is that if you do that, you just kind of take your eyes out of focus. You don't really think about things. I have a big window that overlooks a canyon where I live, and I'll just let my eyes just lose focus, and I'll stare out there for a good 5 minutes, just in a state without much thought of anything. And I found that I can really consolidate information. And when I used to think I was more efficient to just push past that,
Mhm, plow
and
through
now
and
science is finding that instead of massed learning, where we think, well, we got 3 hours and this is what I'm going to accomplish with my horse today, all these tasks, if we space that learning out, then that is so much more effective. Um, and we've done that we're finding out, like in medical school, where they used to have people just cram and learn things and find that they were really not holding on to the information as much if they spaced it. In other words, if you tried to learn everything about a certain subject in 8 hours, if you
mm,
spent the same 8 hours but you broke it up into 2 hours per week, at the end of the month, your brain would hold more information and have created more connections with your existing neural networks in your brain that you'd have far exceeded what you would have done to have continued to do that. And I don't know how many times I've heard stories about horses where a horse might pull up lame out of a training program and uh, so get some rest, and then pull up lame again and get some rest, and eventually recover and find that they were far beyond the other horses, um, because of that uh, opportunity. The injury conspired to help their brain process things the way the brain does. Now, we
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
say, follow this method or do it this way. But regardless of whatever method you follow, you're still dealing with the brain. So why not optimize your approach to working with the brain the way the brain works, and using those pieces of that method? Because I don't want to throw out all tradition, because there's reasons that some traditions work. But I think, you know, if you know the how, science can provide the why. And if you understand the why, your how can get so much better.
Sure, sure, absolutely. And that's as you're talking about the evidence-based horsemanship, right? Really knowing what's happening kind of under the hood, right? To dictate what your process is.
Right. And, this myelination I talked about, as you learn, you excite certain neurons in your brain, and they'll rush to those neurons. Here's the big term for the night: oligodendrocytes. They they rush to the scene, and if you fire those neurons 2, 3 times, they'll start to wrap a fatty wrapping around them, and it's called myelin. Foals, they myelinate quickly around the cerebellum and the motor area because they have to be on their feet very quickly,
Mhm.
um, to survive. Um, so if we myelinate areas of our brain, they become even more efficient. So here's two neurons talking to each other. They're naked neurons. This isn't an X-rated show, but they're naked neurons here, firing. The messages oftentimes don't make it all the way down into the neuron. They dissipate off. They're weak.
Okay.
The information traveling over those neurons that are unmyelinated probably travels about 2 miles an hour. However, if we can myelinate areas of the brain in our training with horses, that information won't dissipate. It won't get lost. It'll pass neuron to neuron to neuron, and the information travels about 200 miles an hour. So
Wow.
basically, you'll become so efficient and have things that become almost automatic and so quick. There's almost no thought involved if we take the time to myelinate correctly. You can myelinate the wrong thing. That's the catch.
Okay.
It works
Okay.
just as well. If I take a big old horse into a trailer and it knocks me down and runs off and eats grass, and I pull that horse off the pasture and put him back in the trailer and it knocks me down again and goes off and
Mhm.
eats grass, now I'm starting to fire those neurons, and the horse is just getting a message in their brain that, oh yeah, I go into this dark area, I just knock this human down, and then you eat. That it's not thought of to get one over on you, to play a trick on you. And
Right.
if
He's
you
not just being a bad horse, right?
yeah, and especially he's not going back to the pasture afterwards and say, "Did you see me make a chump of that guy?" And all the horses in the whole pasture laugh, although
Right.
some people treat it like that.
Mhm.
But to understand, hey, I'm probably myelinating the wrong circuitry here. And so I've got to back up and I've got to myelinate a different pathway because this is not going to be efficient. And then somebody's going to have to come rehab that horse, because the horse will be called a bad horse. But we're no different in how we myelinate our brains. So if I start to play a musical instrument at first it's very clumsy and I'm sending these neuronal firings. But after a while, as I get smoother, I start to myelinate pathways. So if I'm using my left hand to play a bass guitar and hit certain notes, then the area of my brain that controls my left hand will actually get more efficient. And so Yo-Yo Ma, the cellist, has actually said that it's more efficient for him to visualize in his mind practice than it is to actually physically play it, because he physically knows how to play it, but he'll fatigue, or, it'll become more of a physical task when he needs it to be more of a cognitive task. And so he can hone his skills better by replaying them cognitively. So how do we do that with our horse? Well, I know you're a dressage guy. Um, it can be easier for a ranch horse. For example, they know why I'm side passing if I'm going to open a gate. So
Sure.
cognitively, they have an understanding already. If I'm pacing a cow, they know why I'm changing that gait, transitioning to keep up with that
They can
cow.
kinda see the job, right?
Right. So it's a little more of a challenge if you're just doing a task or a movement to get the horse to understand. But you can still do that by how skillful you are at rewarding the horse for what they do. So your timing. And a point I want to make is that there's a difference between pressure and release and pressure and relief. So,
Oh.
and it's not just semantic, and that release is what we do, but relief, only the horse can tell us that they understood what was
Mm.
what was going on. I mean, if I whip and spur my horse like crazy, and then I stop, the horse knows there's a release there, but have they actually felt relief? Has their nervous system actually changed as a result? And so we can be so
That's
much
a
more
really great
effective with the nervous system if we're providing relief. And that calls for a conversation between two nervous systems, you and your horses.
So how do we feel how do we notice the difference?
Well, when your horse sighs, when your horse takes that heavy breath, when when we've challenged our horse and now we're looking for signs that they're actually able to quickly self-regulate. By what I mean by that is they it's they may get hyper alert for a moment or a short amount of time, but what we want to see is not their head staying up there, not their lips clamped tight where their mouth is dry. What we want to see is their eyes start to blink. We want to see their head start to lower down below the withers. We'd like to see a yawn or two. That would really be good. But those are all ways that our horse can tell us that my nervous system is changing. There's a lot made about the licking and chewing. Let me just kind of clarify what's going on a neurobiological level. There's your ninth cranial nerve, ours and our horses, is the glossopharyngeal nerve. And the interesting thing about it, it's all parasympathetic fibers. So all those fibers are parasympathetic, and they go directly to the salivary glands. So basically, all that's really happening is that if we've got a tight mouth and we're sympathetically aroused and our mouth is dry, our lips are tight, as we start to come back to homeostasis and back to a parasympathetic mode, the salivary glands will be reactivated. So they'll start to lick and chew. And you'll notice this. You can take, all kinds of sugary grains and put right under your horse's nose. But if they're sympathetically aroused and they're hyper alert, they have no interest in
Mhm.
in eating. So to rest and digest, to go back to parasympathetic mode, they have to loosen those lips. And sometimes it's a great indicator when your horse's head's up above the withers and they have some acetylcholine, they're really focused, They have some norepinephrine. They're aroused to a certain state, and you can tell that they're not over aroused because you'll still sometimes see the mouth will be pretty placid and pretty loose. So
Okay.
that's not the only indicator, but those are some. So if we continue this pattern of challenge and allowing them to reset, challenge and allowing them to reset, we'll get really good at recognizing when our horse is getting relief because we'll provide the release and then you'll watch your horse just calm right down, bring themselves right back.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we give the release, but then we have to watch to notice when they've actually found the relief.
Yeah. If you want it to register at that deeper level, because certainly it's
Okay.
going to feel, for example, um, people will spank their horse, pat their horse. I
Mhm.
see this all the time. I went to Spanish riding school and I saw them whack on their horse. And so, I gave a clinic there. We talked about this having been tradition, but and some people will argue, well, my horse licks and chews when I do this sometimes. Well, there's no correlate in nature to go along with a spank. If you watch horses, they'll aloe groom on each other's withers. Their
Mhm.
mothers lick them. So it's mostly rubbing and that type of thing, scratching that they respond to. You'll watch them sort of tense up when they take that spank, but the reason more than likely that they lick and chew after they get that little spank is that they know that work is over for that task they got asked to do. So once they get that release, then they feel better, but they tolerate the spank nonetheless.
Gotcha. Because they know what it means.
They know what it means, and so that's more for us. I don't know where it came from sports or whatever. Uh, but
I had a
if you
teacher
watch
years
that,
ago that told me that only dogs and football players like the padding stuff.
you know, uh, it's good. We're in an age, Patrick, where things are really going to become amazing because medical technology is changing so fast that we'll eventually our horses and us will have wearable technology so that
Mm.
we'll know when we're upsetting the horse's nervous system through what we get through this technology, and we'll kind of know how well we're sending messages. So for some people that's fascinating. For other people they say, oh hell, uh-oh, this horse is
Frightening.
going to tell on me.
Right.
Right. But
Right.
horses are going to be able to tell us in a way that now is just an interpretation. We try to interpret what the horse is saying. There's something called near infrared spectroscopy. That's another fancy term, but it's like a functional MRI. And for your listeners, a functional MRI is an MRI that takes a picture of your brain in real time. So if you were reading a book, I could look at the scanner, I'd see which areas of your brain, your occipital lobe would light up, and I'd be able to see that because blood and oxygen would rush there. But these are huge facilities, and you know it's difficult to get a horse. A horse is not going to stand still for as
Mm.
long as they need to get good pictures. But we're learning that you can create almost like a bathing cap that would fit on a rider and fit on a horse. And there's experimentation going on right now that's actually looking at areas of the brain and how these two species, human and horse, interact. Um, so
Okay.
we're not all that far off from some really amazing things. And in fact, I always tell people if your horses could talk, and I went out there in the pasture and had a conversation with them, what would they say about you? Um, and that's
Mm.
always something good to keep in mind if you think their nervous systems are going to tell on you.
Yeah, that's so true. That's something I like to think about. I tell my students all the time. When you're riding, when you're doing an exercise, whether you're riding or whether you're doing it on the ground, if your horse were to go out in the paddock and tell his friends about that exercise, what would he say he was asked to do? would he just say, "Oh, I don't know, I got kind of pushed over here to the left and I got pushed over here to the right and they kind of pulled back and they kicked me every now and then if they thought I was too slow?" Or would they be able to say, "I was doing a canter half past, I was doing flying changes, I was," would they actually understand the exercise in the way that we might describe it to each other?
Yeah, not exactly, but there's an area of your brain called the basal ganglia. It's a whole bunch of different uh, uh, areas of the brain, but they all have a different loop to them. There's a cognitive loop that goes through an area called the caudate. There's a motor loop that goes through an area called the putamen. There's the limbic system that's the emotional piece. And you could drill your horse just worrying about the motoric piece, which a lot of people do. I just want that horse doing what I tell him to do.
Okay.
Um, and that goes into the basal ganglia, which becomes an automatic behavior. But if you create that automatic behavior where limbically they were sympathetically aroused, highly sympathetically aroused, then the next time you ask for that motoric pattern, you're going to have that motoric pattern with that high sympathetic arousal. And if
Gotcha.
your horse understands what you're asking, then you handle the cognitive piece. But otherwise, you're going to ask for a motoric task. And if you ask a little differently, you're going to get confusion because it's not going to match up perfectly to what you've asked before, because cognitively they don't understand what you're asking. So you really can't ignore any of these components, because once you put it in the basal ganglia, it becomes automatic. When you learn to drive a car and you first began to get familiar with your automobile, you looked at the speedometer all the time, you looked in the rear view mirror, you checked to make sure everything was going right. You knew where all the other traffic was. Your basal ganglia, after a while, said, "Patrick, we got this. Just give it to us. If somebody runs out in the road, then you can use your frontal lobe. But for right now, just give it to me automatically." And so you drive to work now and you have no idea how you got there because your basal ganglia got you to work.
Gotcha.
But what we want to do is, if we are creating habits, if we're creating automatic behaviors, we want to be precise, because what we're going to get back is what we put in. And
Mm.
oftentimes the horse gets blamed. Now they're getting more sympathetically aroused because they're getting punished for something that we put in. So I do think we have to understand the language of the nervous system. And if we do, we can communicate. And if we understand that what we're getting is behaviors, what we're getting is what we've wired in the brain. But that horse is not actually, they don't have the same frontal lobe capacity to, say, I'm just checking out. I'm not doing work today. Tell that guy to just piss off, right? And when we treat it that way, we're just falling farther behind in what we could get with our horse. Because if you get that harmony and the synchrony, and the horse knows that you understand their nervous system, they start to trust in that. There's a real emotional stability, emotional balance in your horse understanding that you understand their nervous system. And when
Mm.
that happens, your cues can be so subtle. It's a dance. I like to think of it as a signal noise ratio. So your signal is what your horse is listening for. But if there's a ton of noise, and noise is sympathetic arousal, noise is, you know, uh, forcing your horse to do something where they don't quite understand. This all creates noise where they can't find the signal because you have too much interference. So
Mm.
your job actually is to decrease the signal. When your horse asks, "Am I safe?" You're able to answer that. When your horse feels uncomfortable, you're able to work with him to work through that. You'll decrease the noise and they'll begin to trust your understanding of their nervous system. And that's when your signal can become so subtle, and they'll hunt for that. And you'll see those riders that you just think they're telepathic. And even the writer may think they're telepathic, but there are small sensory signals that you're giving to your horse that they're picking up on. So it behooves us all in our horsemanship and in our welfare of horses. In fact, that's probably something I should mention is that, with this whole social license idea and
Mm,
dressage coming under the microscope, racetracks having to close, Olympic events that get canceled, if we are not going to work with the nervous system and we're not going to understand it's harder and harder to get away with being overly aggressive and using excess force with a nervous system, and we are all going to lose our sports, and
mhm,
that may not be a big exaggeration, you know,
right.
and especially if we have uh, wearable technology that indicates this horse is stressed, this horse is in pain, etc. So if we learn to work with the horse, it's a win all the way across the board for us
Mm.
and our horses.
Yeah, and when we talk about using excessive force and going to some of the things, some of the techniques that we see some people go to that are the ones we're talking about being under the microscope, I think one of the things that can often get overlooked is that not only are we working with the horse's nervous system, but we're also working with ours.
Absolutely. It's two nervous systems in communication with one another. And being aware of that is so key. In fact, I tell people sometimes, let's say you're driving to your barn, pick a mailbox, pick a big boulder somewhere as you drive to the barn, and ask yourself at that point, where is my nervous system right now? Am I agitated? Am I
Mm,
angry? Am I not focused? And what do I have to do to change that before I start to ask another nervous system to interact with mine? Because we absolutely have responsibility for our own nervous system. And
mhm.
if you're anxious, if you're fearful, that's not something to be ashamed of. I mean, all those things can be worked with, but it's when we hide them that it comes back to haunt us. And
Yeah,
so,
it's not a fake it till you make it sort of operation, right?
yeah, I'm so tired of hearing cowboy up after somebody's had a concussion and still has symptoms, you know,
Right.
or, put on your big girl pants and get back up there and actually eh, getting one traumatic brain injury actually increases your chances of getting another one. And if you had more than one, then it increases even more so. So you you become more vulnerable. So you want to allow your brain to heal. You want to allow your psychological well-being to be resilient and in place before you step up there and send all these signals. In fact, I won't go into it, but I would encourage your readers, if they haven't heard of Clever Haunts, to look up that
Mm,
story of the horse that is so sensitive to its owner's small and subtle behavioral changes that the owner wasn't even aware of it. Um, and I don't think Clever Hans was necessarily, he may have been exceptional, but I think all horses have a sensory system that would blow us away if we understood how well they are reading us
and
and
do you
everything
think that
around
that's
them.
part of the prey animal necessity and part of the an animal that lives in a herd that has to be aware of everyone and everything then as a result of being a prey animal?
Absolutely. And in fact, that's why I had mentioned earlier, your horse is always going to ask you, am I safe?
Mhm,
Even if they balk for a moment and stop, being able to be aware of that versus saying, I'm not answering the question. I'm just forcing you on through. I want to the horse might, want to put his head down so it has binocular vision to step up onto a trailer, and we yank the horse's head up and we force them onto the
mm,
trailer, and let's say they bang a hoof. There, we've actually proven to them, you may not be safe. I'm not even listening um,
mhm. Not
to
only is
this.
that environment safe, but you as a handler are not safe because you put me in that spot.
Yeah, and their eyes are designed they don't see as clearly as we do. You know, what we see at 35 feet, they need to be 20 feet away. So they have a number of rods in their eyes that allow them to take in a lot of light, but they don't see things as clear and precise as we do. But what they do see that we don't see is motion. They pick up motion. They have neurons
Mm,
that fire like that with motion. So any fast movement or something in the horizon we don't even recognize that moves is an unidentified object oftentimes. And it it's very hard for them to bring their attention back to you if there's an unidentified change in the environment. And you know, you've seen this 1,000 times. You left a raincoat hanging on the fence and you rode by with
mhm.
your horse and never even realized the change in the environment. But when the two went to match up for the horse, they have to identify what that is, because if they don't, everything's a predatory threat. Anything that's unidentified is a predatory threat unless proven otherwise. So sometimes our job is just to prove otherwise. And if you can set your horse's nervous system and you can make things neuro exercises, then horses can do anything once we take care of that noise. I mean, I live out, I got a Mustang off of Mesa Verde, which is a national park just 8 miles up the road from me. And I can tell people that horse was not standing out there saying, I hope a human comes along, teaches me to trot, teaches me to back up, teaches me. So, you know, it's egotistical to think that we're teaching all these different things to horses. Sure, we may direct them and put them in a certain sequence. But if we want to do that, we have to have we have to work with their nervous system for them to optimize those types of things. And they're once you take care of the neurological communication, it's amazing the horse that's able to show up for you. And so I tell
Mm,
people, you know, don't believe a thing I say. Go ask your horse. Actually, think of it this way. Look at your horse a little differently. Think of their nervous system, and you can't go backwards. It's almost impossible then to work with your horse once you've stepped over that line. But stepping over that line's not scary. You don't have to let go of all the things you've learned before, but you can modify, you can hone, you can actually improve where you were before by understanding the neurobiology of your horse and your own.
mm. Sure. I really love the phrase that you used there is thinking of it as a neuro exercise when you're working with your horse. I think even just thinking of any task that we have as a neuro exercise for your horse, that will really change the way we present it to them.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I know a guy who everybody says he's got such great horses, but you know, I don't know why anybody pays him. He just sits on the fence and watches them all the time. Right? So, and it's basically neuro exercises. You learn something, you learned it briefly. I think you got it. Let me give you time to dwell on it. Let your
Yeah.
brain replay it. In fact, maybe I'll even put you up today and I'll go get another horse. And maybe it'll be those 20-minute episodes that I've had with 20 different horses than if I would have spent 2 hours with one horse. And I probably wouldn't be as far along with that one horse as I would have been had I put them up.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go. That's a great thing to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, so we work with their nervous system, and when we become really good at that, um, we we don't train rigidly, we train flexibly, and then we have a lot more options.
Mm. Yeah. Well, and the nervous system would be more open. The horse's mind would be more open to those options, right?
Instead of two rigid patterns, one behavior after another, after another, after another. So you would end up with a rigid pattern, neuronal pattern, and you'd get what you want, and maybe you'd get that behavior, But what happens if you take that horse then outside of the arena and you go for a trail ride?
Yeah,
They
it
come
doesn't leave room
apart
for
with all the
deviation.
things that they experience. But if you've allowed your horse some agency, some problem solving, if you've allowed them to understand what it's like to feel sympathetically aroused and know that there's a safe spot on the other side, and after a while, now instead of train this and train that and train this separately, you train like this and you train like that. And then these neural networks overlap. Same thing happens with us. So if somebody has isolated bits of information and then they finally take a class on something and they say, oh, yeah, I see how this fits. Oh, yeah, now I know how this comes together. And then pretty
Mhm.
soon, actually biologically, not just on paper, biologically, those neurons will intermesh and you'll broaden your neural network. And that's when you say, yes, I got this. And that's your big dopamine hit. So your horse's brain has the same neurochemistry, it has the same neurobiology. So why wouldn't you want to set it up so your horse is learning so much to have this dendritic forest of all these branches? And then every time your horse is able to do what you ask, they get a big dopamine hit. What's going to
Mm,
happen is they'll start searching it out. And you'll say, how did my horse get so smart? They're
right.
learning
Start
to
learning
learn.
so fast, it feels, it feels like you're cheating.
It's cheating. Actually, you're making your horse an addict. They become addicted to learning.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, absolutely. And you can see that when you work with horses in the way that you're talking about. They're always like we use the joke, like, "Hey, give me my ball back. Like I want to keep playing. Like let's keep doing that." Right? Where they don't want to quit. You take them to the gate, you put them out in the paddock and they want to follow you back. Like, "Hey, come on, we're not done yet." Right? That's such a great feeling too.
Because they know the cocktail that you can serve.
There you
But
go. And you're the bartender.
if
Yeah.
the only
Yeah.
cocktail you're serving is a lot of norepinephrine and a lot of cortisol, and they're sympathetically aroused with you all the time, that's not a drink that they want. And when you take that horse out of the pasture away from its buddies, you're not offering a good chemical. You're only offering what's called oxytocin withdrawal. So, oxytocin is a neurochemical that's linked to bonding and trust. That's what they
Hmm.
get in the herd, and it feels great. So, if you're going to take that away, you should have some other neurochemical that's you can offer your horse to make them want to be out there with you. Or you can just sympathetically arouse them, drill them, get after them, punish them, and they're not going to be standing in the front of the line for you to come back and work with them the next day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why
Gotcha.
can't I catch that damn horse?
Right. Right? He knows I'm trying to work with him, and he just doesn't wanna work. He's just a bad horse. He's got a bad attitude.
He's flipping me off.
That's it. That's it. He's as somebody I know says, he's voting with his feet.
And they don't want trouble. Basically, the horses they want homeostasis. That's their biological balance. And they're designed that when they get outside of homeostasis, they want their nervous system to pendulate and come back down to where they feel at their biological balance, right?
Mhm.
And so, you know, when they're bucking, when they're kicking, when they're pawing, when they're doing all these things that we don't want them to do, it's not pleasurable unless, of course, you can be trained to do that.
Mhm.
Bucking horses will know that this is going to last about 8 seconds. I'm going to get some feed.
Yep.
But for the most part, when you're sympathetically aroused and it's not a good feeling, they don't want to be there. So I think our job is to say, you know what? I see you're uncomfortable. And I see we're not going to really get too far if we try to work when you're this uncomfortable. So, what do I need to do to show you that you're safe? And what do I need to do to make you comfortable? So, you've got to be somewhat cerebral and understand your horse's nervous system so you can help them to get there. Um, but if we get frustrated and we're really not willing to learn our horse's nervous system, there are horses that you can then use. You know, they're on the carousel, or you put a quarter in them, and they're in front of the dime store, and
Right.
they'll do exactly what you want when you every
There you
time.
go. Every time. Sometimes those are the best, right? As it's harder to make a mistake on those ones. Yeah. Well, if I could just clarify one thing that you mentioned about the asking your horse, you were using the analogy of turning to the left, and you talked about doing it 4 times.
Mhm.
Was 4 times just a number that you brought up, or is that a specific number that the brain processes through?
Yeah, and it's probably going to be a little different for every horse.
Okay.
But we know brains love novelty. You get a big dopamine hit with things that are new. And so, and when we drill, just like us, we diminish the dopamine that would have been attached to an activity so that, you know, it may be some horses are able to tolerate better, but you'll know they'll become robotic, they'll check out,
Mhm.
they'll do what you want, but it's almost as if they're not with you. They say, "Okay, I'll lend you my body, you know, let's make this left turn for the 14th time."
Mhm.
But here's what I would do. If it relates to new learning, once you're sure your horse has something, they got it down, try it again to make sure that, yep, we do have that. And maybe you might say, well, just one more time, I'm not quite sure. But beyond that, you'll start to drill. And what you want to do is you want your horse to consolidate that when they've got it. As soon as they've got it, let their brain, because their brain is going to process it better than you can do physically, right?
Mm.
If you're a skier and you go down a ski slope and you go down once or twice, and then you sit in the ski lodge or you sleep that night and about you think about that uh, that skiing, you're going to do that more accurately than if you go up and you get tired and you get worn out. And so that's what you want to wire in. If we put somebody in a functional MRI scanner and we give them some information, if we leave them alone right after we've taught them something, let's say they did a motor task. So you got your right hand and your left motor strip is lighting up. If we leave them alone and they're lying flat, they're not using their arm anymore, their brain will still replay and that motor
Mhm.
strip will still light up. But if we interfere with that, and I said we're to say, "Well, how you doing in there?" or "What's going on?" or I pat them, right?
Mm.
Their mind goes blank. They lose that replay. So it's called hippocampal rehearsal. And so
Okay.
you want to put that in the hippocampus, that area of the brain that's going to replay it, and you want to get it right. But if you over drill, actually, that's not where it's going to go. It's just going to become a rote motor motor task. So what we want to do is put it uh, and refine it by letting the brain do what the brain does best.
Mm.
In fact, we take credit. The brain is always working. The brain is always wiring and rewiring. And the same with our horse. When we say, wow, I just came up with a great idea. Your brain says, bullshit. I've been working on this for 3 weeks. And here's this guy taking total credit for it.
That's great. That's great. So then in that time of the hippocampal rehearsal that you talked about, that's a lot in you hear in sports psychology, right? The mental rehearsal, the replay that you do in your brain. So that's the same thing essentially.
Absolutely.
Okay. And so
Absolutely.
now that is that linked then when we talk about stoke time for the horse, letting the horse stop and process. Is that are we assuming that that same thing is happening?
That's what's going on. If we allow our horse to come back down, especially we start to see that blinking and they seem to be processing information. Because remember, when they're sympathetically aroused, that's when we're encoding information. When they come back down to homeostasis, that's when they consolidate it. And so
Okay.
that is the replay. And in horse circles, it's called soak somewhere else. To old time Westerners, it might be dwell time. But in fact, it's very hard for trainers, I think, to use that effectively in their toolbox, the pause, because I think oftentimes the public says, "Well, how many times did you ride my horse in an hour?" Or, what exactly
Mhm.
was going on, when maybe you really learned a key chunk of information and your horse had it in the first 15 minutes, and it would have been much better to say, "You know what? Let's just put you up right now
Just be done.
and
Mhm.
let you dwell on that." But we feel compelled to add something else on and something, but think that something else is going to compete with what you already taught. And then
Right.
something else is going to compete with what you already thought. So now we're asking our horse's brain to take all this in with competing information and try to sort it out. That's unfair, actually.
And that processing is expensive also, right? Like when we talked about the, hyperarousal, that's expensive for the brain. Similarly, the soak time would be expensive, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Is there a
Absolutely.
time frame in there? So let's say we've got that 15 minutes and we come to something really good with our horse and then we put him up and maybe we pull him out for another 15 minutes later. Is there a time window that we can say, okay, within half an hour, within 3 hours, he's had sufficient soak time for that? Or is that different depending on the horse too?
Like humans, everybody's different, and that's what you'll have to experiment with. Every time I give a clinic, there's always an engineer in the crowd who says, "Well, is that like 1.5?" And I say, "No, no, no, no. It's not a set amount. We're talking about biological matter, and horses have different neurochemistries. And so, if you've got a flighty Arab, that's really sympathetically aroused, and you're not quite sure that they got some information, or if they did, they may need more time. And you may have a draft horse who you think's dwelling all the time.
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah, and so you'll get to know your horses. And I think that's the art and the science of horsemanship. It becomes an art to start to work with the nervous system. And if you can get both working for you, that's actually one of the reasons I wrote the book Neuropoetry, because I wanted to draw that connection between felt art and neurology, the science. And I think both are combined. Uh, so every horse is different, and every student is different. Everyone has a different nervous system. There's old adages: calm cowboys have calm horses, and nervous cowboys have nervous horses. There's a lot of
Mhm.
research to show how people's nervous systems impact their horses. And so there's messages that you send to your horse that you're not aware that you sent to your horse. And the only way they could be responding to that is because your nervous system is speaking to them, even when you think it may be silent.
Mhm.
Um, I've dissected out so many horse brains, and I know them inside and out. There's lots of convolutions, lots of folds in the nervous system. I mean, in the brain. And that means there's more brain matter. So, a rodent has a smooth brain, but there's all these folds just like we have. And if you spread them out and could unfold them, there'd be about 2 square meters of brain mass um, that the horse has to use. And I think we underestimate their intelligence because we measure them with human measurement, and we expect them to do a human task, and that's how we're going to measure intelligence. But I don't think
Mhm.
that if they don't have a frontal lobe that works the same way, you know, determining whether my horse can tell a star from a triangle isn't a real good indicator of my horse's intelligence. But if their sensory system is picking up something that is so subtle, I think that's where the magic lies. It's been overlooked. And I truly believe in the future that we'll find horses are, we may not even want to call it intelligent, much more sensitive and aware than we could ever
Mm,
have given them credit for.
yeah. I think that's a good thing to think about when we talk about a horse's intelligence or when we talk about a horse's awareness. What's that line that if you judge a fish's intelligence by its ability to climb a tree, it'll spend its whole life believing it's dumb.
Right.
Right, like, that just doesn't
Right.
it's not necessary. So when you talk about the horse judging between the triangle and the star, is that something that's useful as a species for a horse, right? That's something that we put value to, but does that really make sense for a horse?
Yeah, and their brains are designed to perfectly meet the evolutionary niche that they're made to to work in. And in that respect, they're just incredible animals. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, we've gone down the road quite a bit, maybe even longer than we thought we would. A number of people had asked some questions, and I could address one or two of those that came up.
Perfect. That'll be great, yeah, and then we're just gonna have to do this again to deal with more questions because
I've
I feel like we
enjoyed
could talk
this.
a long time. This is so great, and thank you for calling that out. I wanna be really respectful of your time. I really appreciate that. So, one of the questions that came up from Laura is about horses processing trauma in the mind and the body. And she's asking, is there a similar re-seeing of the trauma like in humans? And how do you help a horse to break the cycle of fear?
Mm, yeah. Um, because they don't have that same frontal lobe capacity, they're really not going to catastrophize. They're not going to relive it in exactly the same way. But nonetheless, they they have a structure called the amygdala, just like we do.
Okay.
It's a small structure that's associated with fear, and it's actually attached to the hippocampus, the structure we were talking about with memory. So you can etch in a trauma, and you'll have a memory that you can't get rid of. That's a flashback. And so they can be in similar situations. And you may inherit a horse and they come apart for you don't know what kind of reason based on some sort of past event that maybe the surroundings, the environment are similar to what caused the trauma. So the question is, how do we get around that? Well, this is rehabilitation. We may need 100 good experiences to create enough serotonin and neurochemicals that allow the horse to feel safe in the situation and allowing them to reset their nervous system. Now, that pathway, and I should tell you about this, there's something called long-term potentiation. Uh, and I don't want to go too far afield, but long-term potentiation means that if you keep firing neurons, eventually, over time, you're going to strengthen that neuron. It'll get myelinated and become a superhighway.
Okay.
But it takes a long time, and you have to do that over a period of time. That's how we become experts in things. But there's only one instance where LTP can occur in a single trial, and that's trauma. So that trauma
Oh,
can be so etched that now we have a superhighway in the horse's brain. And so what we have to do is we have to convince that horse, and I don't mean, convince them, I mean actually convince their nervous system that
mhm.
even safe situations that they now see as dangerous, this hyper alertness that they're feeling, we have to allow them in small steps we have to change the neurochemistry. Often one of the biggest things we can do is offer dopamine, and dopamine comes from curiosity. So if we can get our horses curious about things and willing to investigate things, sometimes they'll move out of that and they'll become people say, well, my horse has become more brave when they're wanting to investigate something. But just know that what you've got to do then to reset that nervous system is create your own superhighway that's an alternate route. And that may start out as a feeder path. and that may start out as a rocky, unpaved country road, and that may
Mm,
finally just be a paved road. And eventually you may need to create, through safe, uh, consistent patterns, enough that your horse has so many good experiences that now you've created a 4-lane safe highway to compete with a 2-lane trauma. Now most of those messages are going to opt to go the other way. But bear in mind, oftentimes that trauma may still be there. You may not get rid of it entirely, but you can set it up so 95% of that traffic is traveling just the way you want it to.
gotcha, gotcha. And so, like, I'm thinking of just a simple analogy: a head shy horse, right? That you can set things up like you're talking about. You can replay things. You can, through successive approximation, you can change the relationship there. But when the conditions are just right and things feel just off, then they'll revert back to that old road.
Right. And so, I think that really we want to be aware of the potential for trauma, and it can be as simple as, excuse me,
Mm,
ho- the University of Guelph did this study, and they looked at yawning in horses and found that there was a reaction to stress. So sometimes horses will yawn when they colic. Um, Sometimes horses will yawn after they've been challenged. And one of the areas around which there was a lot of yawning was bridling. And so what we found is that some horses, humans have this thing, can get this thing called trigeminal neuralgia. The trigeminal nerve will get irritated, and it
mm,
often happens with dental procedures. Well, there are now a number of veterinarians who think head shaking in horses, maybe a lot of that's trigeminal neuralgia. And it's not going to be a dental procedure per se, but it may be because the horses are so nervous around this bridling thing because that creates potential tension. We may want to go out of our way to allow our horse to pick up that bit by themselves and allow them to spit it out, because we may be creating small traumas just by, I hate to see this. I hate to see somebody just grab that headstone, pull it off, and then you hear clank. And,
mhm.
I almost feel like, let me get a ball peen hammer and just whack a couple molars just to give you the general idea of what may be occurring. So I guess what I want to say is that I think in awareness of their acute sensory system and just how vulnerable they are, and how we can create potential traumas that we call, behavior problems, when actually it's just a nervous system saying, oh man, I am scared to death of
Mm.
this whole deal. This does not feel good to me. um Patrick, let's I'm going to come back. I promise to come back. We'll sort this out. I've
Good.
really enjoyed our talk. It's just flown by. And
It
I
has.
feel
It
like
really
there's
has.
so many avenues that we could go down. I appreciate your listeners tuning in. They're very sophisticated. I've heard some of these questions, and they're just eager learners themselves. So hopefully, I gave them some dopamine hits during the evening and created
Yeah,
a few more dendrites in their brain overnight. But thank you again for having me on.
absolutely. So for folks to find out more about you, Dr. Peters, where should they go?
You can go to my website, which is actually going to be relaunched again here in a few days, horsebrainscience.info. Um, you can find some of the things that I do on Facebook. I've written a couple of books lately. Horse Brain Science is really a deep dive into the science. So what we've talked about today, it's more a big reference manual related to science. Neuropoetry, someone asked a question about that,
Mhm.
and I had written a number of poems and kept them to myself. And they were about things in horses like learned helplessness and some other things that had scientific terminology around them. But um, didn't have all the jargon. So I'd write little stories and turn them into poems. And a number of people read them and said, you should put one or two out there. And I did. And I was dumbfounded. I got about 1,000 likes right away from just putting out these poems. So my publisher said, you need to put these out. And I did. And I put a clinical postscript behind each explaining what's going on in the brain. But people came
Mm.
and said, I now understand. I didn't understand all the science, all this terminology, what was going on. And so my purpose was what's called neuroaesthetics. I wanted to give you a felt sense of the nervous system without the language getting in the way. And so if I've done my job, I the book will give you a felt sense, a visceral sense of
Mm.
of what's going on with the horse and with our own nervous system without all the words interfering.
Well, what a fantastic way of developing our feel, right?
I hope so.
That's
Patrick,
great.
again, thank you for having me on. I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions. Maybe next time we'll just have a question and answer hour.
I think we've got enough questions. We could probably do that. I really, really appreciate your time, Dr. Peters. This was fantastic, and we're going to nail you down on that. I appreciate the offer. We will certainly do this again. So, folks, thank you so much for tuning in for this episode number 68 of Talking About Horses with my special guest, Dr. Stephen Peters.
Thank you.